Now let me turn to the positive side. How can the consumer be protected? How is he protected? The clear answer, the answer that in my opinion cannot be denied, is that the most effective protection of the consumer is free competition. Free competition at home and free trade throughout the world. It's the free market, free private market, with free competition everywhere that is his best protector. The great danger to the consumer is from monopoly, whether it be private or public. The great protection of the consumer is having alternative sources of supply. The thing that keeps the consumer from being exploited by Mr. X is that if Mr. X tries to charge him too much, he can turn to Mr. Y. Governmental regulatory agencies hurt the consumer because they promote monopoly, because they prevent new entry, because they keep down the number of potential competitors. And they do so both at home and in respect to what happens from abroad. Because once government regulates an industry, it no longer can really stand idly by if that industry tends to be affected by imports from abroad, because now it's got an obligation, having imposed costs on the industry, it has to, as it would say, protect it. Within a country, competitive forces make enterprises serve the consumer. That's the only way they can get money. That's the only way they can make money. The only way any enterprise can get money is by selling a consumer something he's willing to pay for. People often say to me, why do you make such a big difference between private enterprise and government enterprise? What difference does it make? Whether you have a great big General Motors Corporation, it's a bureaucracy of the most extraordinary size, or whether you have a great big government corporation producing automobiles. Well, it makes a big difference. And the difference is that there is no way in which General Motors can get $1 from you unless you agree to hand it over. General Motors cannot send a policeman to pick your pocket, but the U.S. government can. And as a result, General Motors must serve your interests in a way which the U.S. government as a whole or a government agency does not have to. It's the possibility of other competition. It's because if General Motors doesn't serve your interest, you can buy a Ford product or a Chrysler product, or you can buy a Volkswagen, or you can buy a Toyota. That's what prevents General Motors from exploiting you. Look at the record. Suppose you compare what has happened over the past 50 years in the development of transportation by automobile and transportation by rail. Is there any comparison between the extent to which the consumer interests have been served in the one case and disserved in the other? Why? Because the automobile industry was competitive, had to compete at home and abroad. The railroad industry was subject to government regulation. Or compare what has happened to the technical perfection of the delivery of sound via hi-fi and of written messages via the post office. No government agency has been behind the enormous technological improvements in the hi-fi area. Government legal monopoly has prevented equally great improvements in the transmission of messages by mail or similar means. Or if you want a still more personal letter, if any of you, and I know there's at least one in this room who is, but if any of you speak native French, French is your native language, try talking French with a graduate of a Berlitz school and a graduate of a public high school and see how they compare. Again, why? Or in the international trade area. I've already mentioned the great case of Fred Laker. One of the worst areas of regulation in the United States has been the Civil Aeronautics Board. It's very hard to believe, but it's true, that since the Civil Aeronautics Board assumed control over the airlines in the 1930s, not a single new trunk line has been approved for operation in the United States. The number of major trunk lines in the United States is now less. There are fewer of them than there were in 1938 or 39. Fares have been kept unduly high. There's strong evidence that had you had free competition in the airline industry's fares would have been roughly half what they are now. We get that evidence from cases which are very interesting. The case of the PSA airline, the Pacific Southwest airline in California, which because it was an intrastate airline, with California being big enough to support an airline, did not have to get CAB approval for its fares and schedules. Now that's a very, very interesting case in two respects. Its fares were about 60% of comparable CAB-approved fares, and yet it made money and did very well. From that point of view, it's a great advertisement for freedom of competition. But the next step is really equally interesting. No sooner did PSA get established than it lobbied the California state legislature to impose the equivalent of CAB within California to prevent other people from doing the same thing. So as I say, it illustrates both parts of the story and explains why it is that you and I as consumers have to look after our own interests and not trust to surrogates, whether they supposedly speak in our interest or not. But consider what has happened in this area. Here, one maverick, Fred Laker, finally, after years of trying, by continually offering to cut fares tremendously between Britain and the United States on a SkyTrain, has forced all the other airlines to come and offer lower fares, which the CAB apparently is more or less forced to approve. Hard to have a more dramatic example, it seems to me, of the virtues of competition and how the consumer is protected. Now let me emphasize, competition does not protect the consumer because businessmen are more soft-hearted than bureaucrats, or because they're more altruistic, or because they're more generous, but only because it is in the self-interest of the entrepreneur to protect the consumer. And on this subject, let me quote you from what the father of modern economics, Adam Smith, wrote 200 years ago in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And here's what he said, and I quote, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. Nobody but a beggar chooses to depend chiefly upon the benevolence of his fellow citizens." So it's not from benevolence, but from self-interest. To return to the FDA, suppose it weren't there. What would prevent business from distributing adulterated products? It would be a very expensive thing to do. Consider the story that many of you heard of a New Jersey firm which had been producing and marketing a high-quality soup product for 50 years very profitably. After 50 years of apparently safe operation, one case of adulterated or contaminated soup cans got out. That company very shortly went bankrupt. That's not a very sensible business practice. But what about the claim that the consumer cannot judge the quality of complex products, that he therefore requires the government support and the help, and this government help? There are two answers to that, and the market provides a very excellent answer. One answer is that when it comes to complicated product, the consumer doesn't really trust his own judgment. He trusts the judgment of middlemen. Let me illustrate. Nobody in this room is an expert about the quality of shirts, ties, shoes, goodness knows what. If one of them goes bad, if you find it's defective, do you go back to the shirt manufacturer? No. You go to the department store from which you bought it. And the department store is acting as your middleman, and indeed the reason the department store can exist and make money is because it can get the consumer to have confidence that the department store will sell it a good product for the price. In the same way, you will rely on a Sears Roebuck or a Montgomery Ward or a General Electric or a General Motors not because they are altruistic, but because it is in their self-interest to build up their capital, to get the reputation and the standing which would be destroyed if they consistently turned out bad products. Moreover, there's no perfection in this world. We're never going to be protected against all defects. What about the claim that if the consumer cannot judge the quality of the complex products, therefore the bureaucrat can? What about the evidence that has appeared that all of the studies about cyclamates, I say all of a very shoddy list of studies that the FDA relied on, they have been disproved. I understand they have been disproved by further research. Now, there's one important difference there. If a business firm does something wrong, as in that case of the soup firm, it goes bankrupt and out of business. But if the FDA or a government agency makes a mistake, that expands the staff of that government agency. What about the claim that consumers can be led by the nose by false advertising? The claim that people like John Kenneth Galbraith have done the most to propose. Well, the simplest answer is that he can't be. And if you don't believe it, ask the man and ask Mr. Ford what happened to the Edsel. Promoted by an enormously expensive advertising campaign, one of the great duds of all times. The fact is that the consumer is going ultimately to decide on the quality of the product he buys and not on the claims. And on the contrary, he's going to be put off by the claims. In any event, again, we must always compare alternatives. It's no good to point out a problem. You can't beat a candidate without a candidate. You must not compare the real world with an ideal alternative. You have to compare real with real. And we have to ask, if business advertising is misleading, is a monopoly of government advertising an answer? I submit to you that I know no advertising widely dispersed that is more misleading than government advertising. If you read what the government agencies say about their products, for example, the advertising used by the Treasury to sell its savings bonds, any bank that advertised its product that way would be hauled before the FTC before you could say Jack Robinson. Or the advertising which Social Security uses to sell its shoddy product. So government monopoly is hardly a solution. Finally, and most important, does it pay enterprises to engage in false advertising? It's like the question of whether it pays them to produce shoddy products. Of course, occasionally, a fly-by-night outfit can make some money by fooling people. But you know, Abraham Lincoln was absolutely right when he said many, many years ago, you can fool some of the people all the time. You can fool all of the people some of the time. But you can't fool all of the people all of the time. The profits of most enterprises depend on continuing custom. They don't depend on a one-time sale. And it is therefore in the long run self-interest of the company, in its own self-interest, to be sure that its advertising corresponds to the product it is selling. As I say, of course, there will always be some shoddy products. There will always be some quacks. There will always be some con artists. We got to wait till the next world before we get rid of them. But we have to look at the real world and ask how the consumer can be best protected in this world. Here, to go back to where I began, the so-called consumer advocates may be sincere. They may be firmly persuaded of the rightness of their case. Or they may be ambitious men seeking acclaim, influence, and political office. It doesn't matter. Whichever be the case, as consumers, we will do best to regard them as confidence men who are out to take us to the cleaners, rather than as our friends who are going to protect us from the big bad wolf of industry. Thank you.